So I wanted to talk about this topic at this conference because the news is something that's been in the news a lot, especially under the heading of fake news. Ask me in the Q&A session what I think about that phrase, by the way. I'm not going to talk about it in the talk. But however we conceptualize the problem, there is definitely a problem. It's a sad fact that it seems like many Americans have trouble telling the difference between the truth and sometimes outright fiction. And this is something that especially has been discussed since the election, but even before the election. Immediately after the election, noting the problem, the website BuzzFeed did a study of some of the top performing posts on social media in the months leading up to the election. And they found a curious thing, that among the different hoaxes that were circulating on the internet in these months leading up to the election, some of them performed even better than the top performing real news stories. So I'm talking here about stories like Pope Francis shocks world, endorses Donald Trump for president, or FBI agent suspected in Hillary email leaks found dead in apparent murder-suicide. These performed better, in many cases, than some of the top-performing stories that were real stories. BuzzFeed then did a follow-up study where they actually called people, and they asked them if they remembered various stories, whether the stories were real or hoaxes. And what they found was that of the people who remembered having heard one of the hoax stories, 75% of them thought that at least one of them was true. And that's rather staggering. And I can't vouch for all the statistics involved in this study, but it's at least an indicator of some kind of real problem. It's worth also mentioning something about the scope of the problem. The second study did indicate that at least the majority of the people who believed the hoaxes tended to lean right or conservative, which is somewhat understandable since there sure were a lot of rumors flying about Hillary Clinton and her emails leading up to the election. And this was, under a Democratic administration. Obama was in power. A lot of people had reason to be critical. But interestingly, if you ask the folks at Snopes.com who specialize in debunking internet hoaxes, they'll tell you that since the election, since Trump took over, there's been an uptick in stories aimed at the left, because now Trump is in power, and there sure are a lot of people on the left who want to believe the worst possible things that they can believe about him. So this is a problem that doesn't know any particular political loyalty. Why do people believe crazy things on the internet? Well, there's a lot of things you could say here, but I want to just highlight two. One is that when they hear a certain story, it fits their preconceptions about the world. And it's not so much that they want it to be true that Trump is doing these terrible things, but they want to believe that they can blame these terrible things on him at least. It's some kind of wishful thinking. But there's another point that has to be mentioned, and that's that it's one thing to have a preconception. You need to have preconceptions to make judgments about the world. It's another thing to then take the time to actually check. And a lot of people simply don't do that. And another way of putting this is that a lot of people just don't take the time to be objective about the news, but probably a number of other things. And so I'm not trained as a journalist. I'm trained in philosophy. And where I think this is interesting to think about is this concept of objectivity and what we can learn from the concept of objectivity to maybe improve our own practices and what we believe about the news. So what does it mean to be objective? Generally speaking, I think it means two things. First of all, it means being loyal to the facts. Now, this is something that objectivists should know something about and care about. Right? We believe existence exists. And we're committed to figuring out what's true, whether it fits our preconceptions or not, whether we like it or not. But it's not just this kind of generalized commitment. It's also having the means to achieve that end. It's using some kind of method to figure out what those facts are, not just believing whatever comes into our head, but taking actual concrete step-by-step steps to figure out what those facts are. And this is, I think, what is summarized in a pithy and apt way in Dr. Peikoff's formulation in Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, when he summarizes Ayn Rand's conception of objectivity. It's summarized as volitional adherence to reality by the method of logic. And so first point there, loyalty to facts, that's turning on your mind, trying to figure out what's true, whether you like it or not. And how do you do that? Ultimately by using some kind of method. And that's the kind of objectivity that we talk about just in ordinary parlance when we talk about, a judge that makes objective decisions rather than, being corrupt or playing favorites. When we talk about an objective scientist who doesn't fudge the data or fall prey to confirmation bias. And yes, when we talk about objective journalism as opposed to slanting or outright fabrication. I want to suggest that Ayn Rand's conception of objectivity can really pay some dividends for helping us to understand the world, especially as applied to the topic of journalism. I think it's going to do two things for us. One is it's going to help us distinguish between objective and non-objective reporting, which is a question about the production of news. Now, most of us are not journalists, so we're not looking to figure out how to be good or bad journalists. But we are, most of us, news consumers. We need to know something about what makes for objective versus non-objective reporting to also decide which reporting to believe. And so it's also going to help us distinguish our own objective and non-objective consumption of this reporting. I think that if we do both of those things, we're going to have a better time knowing and understanding the world events around us. Okay, so how I'm going to structure this talk is by breaking down the concept of objectivity into the two main tools of objectivity that have been described and explained to us by objectivist philosophers: reduction and integration. I'll just say a quick word about what each of these is before I delve into them in a little bit more detail. Reduction is very simply asking what is the source of some claim or belief. Why do you believe it? Where did it come from? What justifies it? In epistemology, generally what you're talking about, ultimately what you're talking about is, does the claim reduce to your sense perception? That is our primary form of contact with reality. If it doesn't do that, it can't count as objective knowledge. But as applied to the topic of journalism in particular, I think what this translates into is asking if you have reason to believe the testimony of another person, especially the testimony of a reporter. This is what separates reliable testimony from simply taking something on faith. There are things that we know as individuals that can help us have rational reason to trust what other people tell us, even if we weren't ourselves there to see the things for ourselves. That's reduction. And integration is asking, does a claim connect with the wider context of our knowledge? Is it consistent with what we know? Reality is non-contradictory. Our beliefs should be too. And I should mention that it's not like these two are completely separate from each other. You're going to be engaging in integration all the while you're also engaging in reduction. You'll see I try to do that with some of the examples that we talk about. But here's how at least I'm going to organize the talk. So let's start by talking about reduction. And again, the basic question we're asking here is, why do we believe what we believe? What's the source of the claim? Is it a good one that somehow relates to our knowledge? And what I want to do is suggest that if you want to find out if there's reason to believe the testimony of a reporter, I have 3 rules of thumb. And I don't mean to claim that these are exhaustive, but I think that if we keep these ideas in mind, we'll be better judges of others' testimony and its rationality. So first, evidence of journalistic reliability. I'm going to go through these point by point. Evidence of the reporter's objectivity. These are slightly different. And evidence of needed specialization given the topics. I'm going to spend some time on each of these, and I'm going to give you examples of news stories where these rules of thumb are either violated or upheld. So we'll start with the first one, evidence of journalistic reliability. And I'll start with an example of a story. Here's just the headline. Trump on revamping the military. We're bringing back the draft. Interesting claim. Would be pretty surprising if true. The draft is pretty unpopular. We'll come back to that issue later. But if we're talking about reduction, we're talking about asking the question, what is the source? Where is this coming from? Who is telling us? Well, the source, as you can see, is a place called realnewsrightnow.com. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of realnewsrightnow.com. A couple people. Most of you have not heard of it. And that's just the thing. You might also wonder who the author of the piece is. He's named R. Hobbes J.D. Turns out R. Hobbes J.D. is the author of all the pieces on realnewsrightnow.com. And if you drill down into the fine details of the site and his biography, you will find he lists all of his journalistic accomplishments. One of them is he is the winner of the Oscar Mayer Prize for Journalistic Excellence, which I take it is his way of hinting that he is a master in the art of baloney. Because the entire site is a fabrication. And if you drill into the details again, it'll have a little disclaimer. This is for entertainment purposes only. It's a satire site, or it's claiming to be a satire site, perhaps to cover itself. But most of the people who share this story, you could have fooled them, because a lot of people pass this off as if it were the truth. And so, my question for them is, if you've never even heard of realnewsrightnow.com, it has no cognitive status in your mind, you've never heard of them, why would you believe anything that they say? Especially if you haven't heard this being reported elsewhere, which is another issue that we're going to get to. So the point here is that reliable testimony about anything other than the most mundane, trivial matters, anything other than asking for directions to a gas station, to rely on it, you should know that you're listening to a real journalist. Why is that? Two things. Journalism is a skill that has to be learned through one means or another. Not everybody is born knowing how to check facts and sources. Not anybody just sitting in their pajamas in front of a blog counts as a journalist, unless they're just trying to fabricate. But that's not even all of it. Journalistic institutions are important. Working for a newspaper or a TV network gives you access to resources that you need to be able to have access to the facts that you want to be able to report about. Not anybody can sit in on a Donald Trump press conference and hear what he has to say. So you don't have any reason to think that this person has access to the facts of this story, and you've never heard of them before. Why would you believe what they have to say? Piece of consumer advice. Claims without any known reliability, where you don't know who the source is, where it's coming from, should just be dismissed out of hand as arbitrary, as so much noise, as like unto gossip that you hear on the subway platform about somebody's love life. I mean, it just doesn't, it should not take up any mental space. Now, that was a piece that was aimed at, I suspect, left-leaning audience that was looking for things to criticize Donald Trump about, as if there weren't enough real things to criticize him about. But, and so the failure of objectivity there, again, is, believing in accord with your preconceptions without taking any time to check. Well, here's another piece that is this time aiming at more of a right-wing audience. far-left group is paying activists a monthly salary to stop Trump. Maybe you've heard this story, I don't know. But who, again, is the source? And this time, you may have actually, I suspect many more of you are going to have heard of the source. It's a guy named Jim Hoft who writes a blog called gatewaypundit.com. And he's a pretty prominent right-wing blogger, and he has a very large following. By his own admission, he has no training in journalism. Now, I don't mean to suggest that you can't have learned the skill of journalism without getting a bachelor's degree at a college or university. I think it's probably the kind of thing that you can learn on the job. But then the question is, well, does this person show evidence that they have been learning on the job? Well, so why does Jim Hoft believe that this is true? Where did he get this idea? His only source for this claim is some website that he found. An ad that is running on a kind of Craigslist-style site somewhere in St. Louis. Someone is offering to pay activists a surprisingly high monthly salary. And that, of course, is supposed to be the scandal. It's, the accusation is they're trying to astroturf criticism against Trump. That should get you outraged, right? So now, if you're learning on the job and you're a real journalist, what you're going to do is you're going to check this out. This is a pretty surprising claim. So is this a real organization? Does it have a history? Do we have any reason to think that they have the massive resources that would be required to fund monthly salaries for months on months? That would be the thing to do. Well, Jim Hoft, along with dozens and dozens of other conservative bloggers and pundits, did not do that checking. Until one did. And it's an interesting story. This claim was debunked in a spectacular way by the Fox News journalist Tucker Carlson. He read this story, and he brought on the alleged leader of the alleged activist group to grill him about this. Basically accused him to his face of this being a hoax. And the activist pushed back for a while. He said, no, I'm really doing this. Finally, at the end, the activist said, no, you're right, it is a hoax. And the reason that I did this was to see how far this story would spread before somebody checked it. And to show how uncritical a lot of people are about the things they believe on the internet. And so Carlson had made his point, the activist had too. Maybe we could forgive Jim Hoft for this to some extent, given all of the other people who were also reporting the same story, but for the fact that he has a really long history of doing this kind of thing. If you Google his name, there's various media commentary sites that record a long record of his having passed off totally unreliable and sometimes fabricated stories. And particularly concerning is that even when this story was debunked in such a spectacular way by another conservative, to this day, if you go to his website, if you go to the page where this story is reported, which is still up, no correction has been posted. And it's not the first time he's done that. This is recklessly unreliable reporting. And the fact is that objective reporters, they check facts. They bother to check facts. They bother to correct errors. And when they don't do that, when reporters don't do that, it gives you the impression that these are people who don't really care about the truth, right? That they're hacks, that they're propagandists. And so I don't put much stock in what Jim Hoft has to say on the internet. Let me give you an interesting contrasting example. I'm sure that many of you remember from 3 or so years ago the riots in Ferguson, Missouri, over the shooting of Michael Brown by the police. And you all know that the Black Lives Matter movement in many ways came out of that controversy, and the slogan, "Hands up, don't shoot," originated with the allegation that Brown had been shot with his hands up. And there were, in fact, eyewitnesses who reported that. So there was some basis for it. This is a report that was widely circulated in the left-wing media. That's why Black Lives Matter latched onto it. However, as most of you probably know, it came out it eventually came out that there was no basis for this, that when the forensics report came back, he could not have been shot with his hands up. And the testimony of the eyewitness who claimed this eventually broke down. It had many inconsistencies. It could not be backed up. Well, there was one journalist who had been reporting on the Ferguson matter. His name was Jonathan Capehart. He's a writer for the Washington Post and for MSNBC. And he's somebody who's a critic of police shootings of minorities and has been following this story. And at the time of the Ferguson riots had passed on the same headlines that had been being spread about how this eyewitness claimed that Brown had his hands up. What separates Capehart is that when this forensics report came out, what separates him from a lot of his colleagues and from somebody like Jim Hoft is that he wrote a lengthy apology in the Washington Post. Hands up, don't shoot was built on a lie. So not just a little correction appended to the bottom of a post, but an entire article explaining how wrong he was and how important it is to be right about such things. That if one is going to fight for justice in one's cause, you can't build such a cause on a lie. And it was a lie. And he doesn't just say it was false, he says it was a lie. I think this is a courageous act on his part, and it's one that got him a lot of flack from his allies on the left and the Black Lives Matter movement. But I think this is honest reporting. He's obviously someone who makes mistakes, but he's willing to correct them, and that is a big difference from someone like Jim Hoft. So another piece of consumer advice. Follow more reporters like Jonathan Capehart, fewer like Jim Hoft. Follow the objective ones, even if they are making mistakes, or the more objective ones. Avoid the recklessly unreliable reporters. Okay, last topic under the heading of reduction. Necessary specialization. Now here's a story some of you have probably heard a lot about recently. Slain DNC staffer Seth Rich had contact with WikiLeaks, investigator says. This is basically a conspiracy theory that's been circulating for some months on the right wing. And of course the idea was that this is supposed to show that it's implying that Hillary Clinton and her campaign had something to do with this as retribution for the WikiLeaks leaks. But only recently in May did Fox News finally start to run with it. You can ask interesting questions about why they chose to do this just then. But, well, again, who's the source for this claim? Now, Fox News is an established journalistic outfit with some degree of reliability. But where are they getting the story? They are getting the story from the claim of, well, it says it in the headline, so that part is right, an investigator who's hired by the family of Seth Rich to uncover the identity of the murderer. Now, to know that this is true, you've got to know something about Seth Rich's emails and whether they were sent to WikiLeaks. At the end of the day, it turns out that Rod Wheeler had no such access to his emails. He was speculating. He claims to have spoken at some time to some federal investigator who told him about this, but who never showed any of these emails. And eventually the family started pushing back and saying, you have no basis for these allegations, you're fired, and please retract this story. He then admitted that he had never actually seen the emails himself. To its credit, Fox eventually did retract this story, not before it circulated around the right-wing blogosphere and not before Sean Hannity went live with it and with the investigator. So I think a bit of reckless, unreliable reporting on their part at first, though they did something to correct it, which is good. But the point that I want to make about this is, in addition to the previous problems that we talked about, look, this is a claim about a secret. It's actually a claim about two secrets. One, that somebody sent these leaks to WikiLeaks, sent these emails to WikiLeaks, which they were trying to keep a secret because it's supposed to be an anonymous whistleblowing site. And then also the identity of the murderer. Generally, murderers try to keep their own identities secret. So that's two different agents who are trying to purposefully cover up some fact, making it therefore very difficult to know about. If someone is going to claim to know that this is true, they're going to have a lot of knowledge. They are going to have some really special access, have some really good sources, because these are facts that otherwise somebody is trying to cover up. They need to have that specialized knowledge, special sources. I mean, think here about Watergate and how Woodward and Bernstein knew somebody who was a deputy director of the FBI, Deep Throat, who was able to blow the whistle on Nixon. Well, that's not what's happening here. Not even by Rod Wheeler's own admission eventually. It's hard to identify these facts, and the further removed some fact is from somebody's direct observation, the harder it is to know, the more specialized knowledge you need to have to do the inference, and none of this was present in this case. This is, by the way, I think something to keep in mind on the other side when we hear various stories about the present administration's ties to Russia. This is, if true, definitely going to be something that all kinds of parties are going to be trying to cover up, and therefore will be very difficult to know, if true. And so the standard of proof is going to be pretty high to prove that this is true. Woodward and Bernstein followed a lot of different paths of evidence before they reported on Watergate. Not just Deep Throat, but they followed the money. So if this is something we can talk about more, I think, in the Q&A session, but something important to remember for that current scandal. But I do want to transition from that to one last point about specialization, because this is something that especially comes up on weightier topics, I think. Anytime you're dealing with reporting about science, science is the most specialized kind of knowledge that we have. And so consider this headline that I saw in the New York Times just a couple of months ago. Climate change reroutes a Yukon river in a geological instant. Now, the first thing I think to notice about a story like this is what's not in the headline. It doesn't say, climate change reroutes a Yukon river in a geological instant, some scientists say. Now, that would already be a far superior headline. It would be true, for one thing, because the reporter here is reporting about an actually published scientific paper. What is the source here? Well, the author is a journalist with a law degree, no scientific training. He is citing a scientific paper. But it's not just the headline, too. If you dig further into the article, you read the first 3 paragraphs of the article, it's all written in the voice of somebody who advocates the theory the scientists are proposing here. So you wouldn't even know that it was a report about a scientific paper until you get well halfway into the article. He's advocating this theory, basically. The reporter is advocating this theory. And he's doing it in a way that also doesn't allow for or acknowledge the inherent difficulty in proving a claim like this. If you actually read the scientific paper, which I did, the scientists do that. They say it's very difficult. Even if suppose you accept that there is massive man-made climate change. Even if there is, it's very difficult to show how such an abstract phenomenon relates to one particular geological event in one instant of geologic time. The scientists acknowledge that. The reporter doesn't. And a sign of that is that the reporter also doesn't cite any possible scientific critics, which certainly could have been contacted, because the scientist in this case is using a somewhat controversial statistical method to show that this must have been caused, or that there was a 99.5% chance that this was caused by climate change. So this is very slanted reporting, obviously. And you've probably seen other articles like this on the topic of climate change. Consumer advice. Separate journalistic from specialized claims when you are reading this, for 2 reasons. One, it will help you avoid believing things that you probably shouldn't, given the actual credibility of the reporter. The reporter is not a scientist, right? But on the positive side, doing this can help you actually learn something about the world, right? Even if this is non-objective reporting on the part of the reporter, if you know the difference between, a scientist wrote this, and the scientist observed a river rerouting, and the scientist observed a glacier melting to cause this, well, those are relatively close to observation facts. They're less abstract facts. These are the kinds of things that journalists are in a pretty good position to be able to report about. And if you know that those are less abstract, but that the claim that climate change caused this is a much more sophisticated, much more specialized, much more abstract claim that you would need a lot more to prove, you can separate in your own mind what you can take for granted from this reporter and what you can't. And this isn't just climate science reporting. This is any time you see some kind of specialized topic being dealt with by a reporter. So, this happens in financial reporting all the time. Here's a headline that some of you might be a little bit more amenable to. Obamacare repeal vote failure threatens tax cuts and stock rally. Even supposing that free market economics is completely true, there's no way that you can deduce from that any kind of prediction about what's going to happen on any particular day of the stock market. And as it happens, the failure to repeal Obamacare did not threaten the stock rally. As you know, we're doing OK. And I haven't checked the market in the last 5 minutes. But so anytime you see specialized claims, learn to separate the more concrete, the more journalistic claims from the more specialized, higher-level abstract claims. And you can learn something about these articles, learn something about the world from these articles. I had another example here that I won't go through just in the interest of time, but of a more objective report that I saw in the Washington Post about another issue in climate science, where I think the reporter did a much better job acknowledging the uncertainty of the question and also quoting from critics. But I want to turn now to the topic of integration, other big tool of objective thinking. Again, integration is looking to see if a claim fits with what you know. And to know if the content of a report that you're reading does integrate, I'm going to recommend 3 more rules of thumb for figuring out whether that's the case. And I'll go through each of these again and with examples. So first, you can use integration to judge the initial likelihood of a story, to check if the story is confirmed by other sources, and to consider the wider context of what's not being reported. Let's start with this first one. What's the initial likelihood? And for this, I want to actually go back to one of the stories that I showed you before, which you remember, of course, was a complete fabrication, this one about Trump advocating the draft. Well, how would you know even to look to see if this was a fabrication? It's enough to say, I don't know who the source is, I'm not going to believe it. But if you wanted to look and see, is this a fabrication, there should be some things about just the very content of this story that clue you off. So here's some knowledge that just doesn't fit with the claim that's being made here. One is that the draft is a really unpopular position. And it would be really odd to see a politician actually advocating for its return. Politicians don't like to support unpopular positions when they're trying to get elected, especially when they're populists, right? And especially when they themselves had so many different draft deferments because of their bone spurs that would make the hypocrisy of such a claim, extreme. So consumer advice, here's a catchphrase. I think it originated with Carl Sagan, I'm not sure. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It would be really odd if a politician were to say this. If you hear one saying it or is being reported as saying it, you want to check to see if this is really true. You want to find some kind of confirmation. So you integrate our knowledge of what's likely with whether to accept this in the first place. So confirmation is then the next topic that I want to talk about. And here I think this is one of the most important roles of integration in deciding what to believe on the internet and in the news. And I'll still talk about the same Trump draft story. So once you realize that this is a strange thing to believe, and you go around checking to see, well, is anybody else reporting that Trump said this? we should keep a few things in mind. If Trump were to say something like this, given that he's a major presidential candidate and famous, and that he has a lot of critics, you would expect this to be widely reported by a lot of people, a lot of news agencies. They'd be chomping at the bit to report something like this about Trump. But as it turns out, it was reported by only one source, realnewsnow.com. Now, there's a trick that I learned as a professor when I was reading student papers, when I was looking for plagiarism. If I see a unique turn of phrase, I'll Google it and see if I can find it somewhere else on the internet. If I can't find it anywhere else, pretty good odds that the student actually wrote it themselves. If, however, I see it copied from another source, it's plagiarism. Now, you can apply the same principle in reverse when you're looking for evidence of fabrication. Fabrication is a kind of originality, right? So Google the phrases from Trump's speech here, which the article quotes, see if they come up anywhere else. If they come up in any other independent sources, it's a good chance that it's actually true. But if all of those sources that do quote the same thing trace back to realnewsnow.com, it's a pretty good bet that it's original to realnewsnow.com and a fabrication. That's actually what happens. So especially when you see highly unlikely to be true claims, you should seek widespread independent confirmation. And this is the same thing, of course, that detectives will do when there's a crime committed and they talk to eyewitnesses. If you have a bunch of independent witnesses who all report the same identity of the murderer or whatever, it's a pretty good chance that they're right about it. But if the witnesses were allowed to collude with each other and there was tampering with the witnesses and someone was giving them a message, this is no longer all that significant. And that's, in effect, what's happening in this story. RealNewsRightNow.com spreads the story everywhere. It suddenly looks like it's being reported everywhere, but it's really just all coming from one fabricated source. I want to give some examples of the issue of confirmation with regard to some weightier issues. And one of them is the Michael Brown shooting that we already talked about. So here was one of the original headlines I was able to find reporting on this. Now, the headline is technically true. An eyewitness to the killing did, in fact, say that the teen held up hands and pled for life before being shot. There was an eyewitness, maybe a couple, who said this. So it's a technically true headline. But of course, at this time, sites like Salon.com were reporting a whole lot about what these couple of eyewitnesses said and not a lot about what the other one said. And this is, of course, where a lot of the outrage over this shooting comes from. And so here's a piece of consumer advice on confirmation, on the importance of confirmation, that it is especially important to seek confirmation when a story is breaking and when you are, in effect, in the haze of war, when you know in advance that rumors are going to be flying and that there are going to probably be conflicting eyewitness accounts. In such cases, you should be really careful about what you believe and about what you share. You should wait for more confirmation to come in. And of course, what happened in this case was that more came in, and it didn't match up with the original eyewitness's claim. There were inconsistencies in the eyewitness's story. Jonathan Capehart called it a lie. But if we're going to use that piece of advice for a story like this, we should also look at another story. Because, of course, the reason that I think so many people were willing to leap on this belief was because, well, they had a preconception that the police were out to get minorities. And, there are some unjustified police shootings of minorities. We can debate about how many, but there are some. Well, by the same token, how would you process a claim like this? Gunmen screaming Allahu Akbar, open fire in mosque, murdering multiple people. This is a story that was pushed by, among other sites, a place called jihadwatch.com. Now, I should say that I find this blog, which is published by a guy named Robert Spencer, to be a useful site. It reports, or at least publicizes reports about jihadist terrorist attacks around the world that are, I think, underreported in the mainstream media. So it's useful for that kind of purpose. But In this case, I have some questions to ask jihadwatch.com because, well, for one thing, you read the headline. There's one thing about this headline that should raise at least a red flag for a moment in your mind, and what's that? Yeah, so why are jihadist terrorists attacking a mosque? Now, that does happens actually probably all the time in the Middle East, but this was a report from Quebec. And so why are jihadists attacking a mosque in French Canada? There was an eyewitness who claimed to have heard this, as far as I can tell, but it very quickly became evident that there was some confusion at the scene, and very soon people started, they eventually arrested, and they found the identity of the shooter, and he was a white supremacist Canadian. This happens, right? So we have a preconception, and probably most of the time you hear about a terrorist attack, it's probably going to, in fact, be somebody who would scream Allahu Akbar. But again, you're in the haze of the moment. You want to wait for the information to come in before you claim any certainty on something like this. And I should say that although Jihad Watch acknowledged that some people were claiming that this was a white supremacist at the time, once again, they never published a follow-up correcting this when the identity of the actual murderer was discovered, which, to me, makes me think that Jihad Watch is a good source for finding news reports that are underreported, but I don't trust their interpretation of these stories all the time. So consumer advice: seek confirmation from a variety of sources, especially sources across the political spectrum. Ones that don't have all of your same preconceptions. Your preconceptions are useful guides, but sometimes they are mistaken in certain circumstances, and you want to have some correction for that. So don't just follow jihadwatch.com. Follow some other sites that also report on international news. Okay. Last major topic under the heading of integration, and that is to think about what is not being reported. And this connects to some issues that are that go beyond what I can talk about today, so maybe some of this will come up in the Q&A. But it can happen that you have a piece of news that is accurately and reliably reporting a certain fact, but the fact that they're not reporting all the facts can change the significance of that. And so here is an example which, fortunately, I don't have to say a lot about because Ilan Giorno prepared us quite well to analyze this one. Here's a report in The Guardian, British paper, early May of this year. And The Guardian was not the only one reporting this. This is based on a totally reliable core fact that the terrorist group Hamas, the one that runs the Gaza Strip, presented a new charter accepting a Palestine based on 1967 borders. Now, what it sounds like that means is that Hamas wants to make peace with Israel because they're going to have two states side by side living in peace. And indeed, if you read the new Hamas charter, which I did, you find that there is language in there talking about willingness to, well, it doesn't quite say willing. It says 1967 borders are recognized as a consensus. So that's kind of already vague, passive voice language. But also throughout the rest of the document, Hamas makes very, very clear that they understand all of present-day Israel to be part of Palestine. And in the very same paragraph where the language about the 1967 borders is used, they talk about the importance of liberating Palestine, so defined to include all of Israel. And so Benjamin Netanyahu shot back very quickly, especially when he saw this headline in several prominent papers, including the New York Times, it was also in CNN, saying, there is no way of reconciling the apparent contradiction in this document without supposing that what Hamas really means is that we're perfectly willing to accept 1967 borders for a while, and then we'll liberate Palestine. Now, of course, they don't say that, but you don't have the data to make that interpretation if you just go on the basis of this Guardian report, which doesn't mention any of these other facts about what is in the charter. You have to read it for yourself. So consumer advice: be aware of how context affects the relevance of data. Out of context, this could look pretty good for Hamas, but when you consider not just the context of the document, but the whole context of history that Ilan Journo reminded us about today, you should take a headline like this with an extreme grain of salt. I have one last example about thinking about what's not being reported, and this is something connected to a story that just broke in the last week, which I thought was very interesting. So you all know that there's been this testimony on Capitol Hill with James Comey about the Russia scandal. And here is a headline that was recently pushed out by Breitbart.com. And actually, I think that is the wrong date. I'm sorry. That was just a few days ago. Comey under oath have not experienced any requests to stop FBI investigations. Now, Breitbart's not the only one reporting this. They are reporting the tweet of somebody who found a passage in the Comey testimony where he does, I mean, this is a direct quote, or I have not experienced any requests to stop FBI investigations. And this, to a lot of supporters of Trump, sounds like pretty good news. See, even Comey agrees that there is no obstruction of justice going on. Well, there's just one problem with this story, is that it's that the quotation here is in response to a different question than what it is implying. You all know, of course, that Comey has otherwise testified that Trump hoped that he would let the Flynn issue go, which is the basis of the claim that people are, it's why people are worried about obstruction of justice. The question he's actually being asked here is whether there were any requests from the Attorney General or other high-up DOJ officials to stop investigations. And yes, the answer to that was yes. None of my immediate superiors at the DOJ asked me to do this. That doesn't mean that Trump didn't, and that doesn't mean that he's saying that Trump didn't. So Breitbart actually acknowledges this point deep in the details of its article. But a lot of other people who pushed this story out did not do that, including the original tweeter, who actually said Trump has not made any requests, according to Comey. So and it's certainly not being mentioned in the Breitbart headline. I think Breitbart does a lot of stuff like this, and I take them with a big grain of salt, too. So last set of points. This is a conference about productive heroes. And I think that it's worth remembering that in spite of the fact that we often have ideological disagreements with journalists, journalists can be productive contributors to the division of labor as well. And to know this, all you have to do is to think of some prominent examples. I mean, think about Woodward and Bernstein and their role in uncovering the Watergate scandal. Think about the Spotlight team that uncovered the sex abuse crisis in Boston with the church. Right? These are people who did an important job conveying important truths to the public. And this is the kind of information that we need to know. We need reliable journalists. We need objective journalists. Unfortunately, today we don't have any consistently objective news agencies. We also don't even have any kind of objective, nonpartisan media commentary. There are all kinds of conservative sites that will do media commentary on left-wing sites. There's all kinds of left-wing sites that will do media commentary on right-wing sites. Nobody does it on both. And we also have no system in place for tracking or rating the reliability of news. And so it's hard to generalize about which newspapers or which sides of the aisle are the more reliable or the more objective, because the news goes by so fast, nobody has a chance to take any of it down or analyze it all at the same time. Also, we have very few journalists who understand the concept of objectivity. I think there are many journalists who are more objective than others, but few have a philosophical understanding of what objectivity means or how to practice it consistently. We also have an administration that is sometimes openly hostile to the concept of objective truth. So we desperately need objective journalists, but they don't have the intellectual ammunition that they need to be that way all the time. And so the last thing I'll say is just that, well, they had a hackathon here the other day, and that makes me think. Objectivists have a pretty good understanding of the concept of objectivity. We understand reduction and integration, and many of us are entrepreneurial. And I think that there's an entrepreneurial activity waiting to occur. We could and should find a way to sell objectivity in the media to the public. I think that there are a lot of Americans who want it, and God knows they need it. Thank you. So Ankar is going to join me on stage. Sorry.
This is just a quick comment, more than a question. Something that really bothered me about the Michael Brown shooting, and you can tell me whether you think this matters. He was 18 at that time, I'm almost certain. And typically the news at 18 starts calling people men and women, yet he was consistently described as a teenager. And to me, that was slanted. And that was really more of a comment than...
I think you're probably right. I'd have to look at it again more carefully to form a considered judgment, but it would be consistent with the other slanting that was going on, that's for sure.
Hi. So I actually, mainly when I go on news, I do it for like school research. Outside of school, I really don't look at the news that often. But when I do look at the news, I try to look and see, like, are there other news sources besides just one that say the same facts, and do they trace back to, you know, just like, well, you said the one website traced back to that fabricated place. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you had any ideas of like a way to track down more reliable information, that like a more reliable news source other than some of the mainstream ones.
Yeah, well, I wish I had a really ready answer to give you on that, but and the fact that I don't, I think, is part of the problem. I'll say two things. One is that there actually are experiments being undertaken now by certain startup companies to create software that monitors social media for the sudden and rapid spread of certain kinds of viral stories, which sometimes can predict whether or not it was fabricated. And I don't offhand remember the name of the company that's doing that. There might even be a couple of them. Using machine learning, which I don't really know what that is, but somebody here can tell you probably. So that's interesting. But then as for going to actual sources, I mean, like I said, there is really no consistently objective source that's available. You really have to follow a variety of sources. My suspicion, and because we don't have reliable tracking of this, I can't prove it. My suspicion is that the mainstream media is more reliable than various forms of alternative media. That does not mean that they are right all the time. It does not even mean that they are right most of the time. I think it means that they're right more of the time than various alternative forms. And in part, that's because of just the momentum of the institutional resources that they've acquired over the years. But obviously, this is something that, you know, it doesn't guarantee anything. People make bad choices, even with the history and the tradition that they've got. So, you know, the most that I can say is follow a variety of sources, make sure some of them are mainstream. I myself read a lot of Washington Post. Not as much New York Times as I used to. I'm not saying the Post is the best at everything. That's all I've got for you on that. But I mean, this is the problem that we need to solve, and somebody out there could do it.
And part of the point you were making in the lecture is to recognize that that's the situation today, that journalism, I think, is not in a good state. I mean, you didn't talk about the whole angle of just as a business model, they're having trouble. I mean, when you look at the number of reporters who are like doing real investigation at the newspapers, and I think TV is even worse. There's almost no real investigation. You have to keep that context in mind when you're reading the news, that that's the state of it, and in terms of thinking about this testimony is reliable or not, it's you have to know, like, this is what's generating it and what's not there. And I think another point you made that's really important is to get, if it all comes back to one source that's dubious or not much evidence, it's easy in today's world that you're bombarded with the same point from 8 different sources. You're getting it in your social media feed and so on, and you trace it back, and it's one little point that someone made, and it's out. I mean, this happens in all kinds of areas, not just politics. So I think nutrition and sort of health facts. You get turmeric is the new, take this 2 times a day, it cures every cancer. And you get it in 10 different newspapers, and then you trace back. It's one study of 8 people, and if you actually read, as Ben was saying, but this is I think what you have to do if you're actually trying to know something about that. You have to go read the actual study, because it's not going to be reported too well. And it's 8 people, and they say it doesn't really show, I mean, the scientists themselves say, it doesn't really show anything. I'm not saying take turmeric now. And that's what the actual evidence is. But you have to do some of that now, because it's not done for you.
I actually had one more thing to say, and somebody else can ask me more about this, but as a rule, I would say don't get your news from social media. There are other ways. Go to the website, the original websites. Go to the New York Times website itself on a regular basis. Use RSS, but get news from social media only as a kind of secondary matter. I can say more about that later if someone wants to know.
Okay, and one last thing is that I wanted to ask, do you think that news in the past, like with newspapers and things, do you think that it was more reliable in the past than it is now?
I don't have a good way of knowing, because I wasn't around for that much time in the past. So since there's other people, I think we should move on, but thank you.
Ben, thanks for a talk on this important topic. I just want to quickly say, since you mentioned the hackathon, that the interest session happened, but the hackathon itself is to be planned, is upcoming.
Good.
And I think what you proposed is a great idea. I would love to see somebody prototype a site that rates news objectively. And if you want to join as a consultant, philosophic consultant or idea man or whatever.
I have more ideas about how that could be done, so yeah.
Wonderful,
hook
so
me
please
up with
participate.
some people.
Question, you mentioned that preconceptions can be useful, and I think that's true. And how do you distinguish between, using your preconceptions in a good way versus confirmation bias?
I don't have anything good to say about that, because, this is running up against the problem of induction. And the area of the problem of induction that's especially hard. When do you know, when you've got enough data to generalize? When do you stop? And especially when you're talking about in making inductions about human behavior, which is what so much of the news is about.
Yeah, or even when you find yourself clicking into a story to read all of it, because it matches with something you already think, right? And you find yourself skipping over the stories that you think you might not even agree with, right? On a certain level, I find myself doing this. It feels like confirmation bias, also feels like a good use of my time. So I don't know. I don't always know how to reconcile.
The one other thing I would say is that there's you certainly know that this claim is reported, and you hear it, and you don't bother to check it maybe, but if you're not going to bother to check it, you've got to file it that way. You've got to think, okay, I heard that this was true. This is stuff I heard. Greg Salmary did a talk on this, where this was like an official category in his epistemic status, stuff I heard. And that's about it. There's a philosopher, William Clifford, who once said, if you don't have time to check, you don't have time to believe it.
Thanks.
Yes, I think, Jason, you're asking a little bit of when do you view your existing knowledge as it's a tool through which you're going to process gathering of new information, and when do you view it as a bias? Is that part of?
How do you avoid accumulating evidence, for some position, but you accumulated it in part because you already thought that was a promising way to investigate? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think, this was imparted in the talk. You really have to read critics and so critics of yourself in that sense, that this is how I'm approaching things. There's people who don't approach things like that. How do they do it? Why do they do it like that? I largely read, and for news in particular, I largely read sources that I don't fully agree with, and I don't think. I listen to NPR way more than I listen to the right-wing media. I think NPR is better, though it's very slanted and biased. But it's challenging in a way that I think you need to keep doing for your own knowledge.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just two observations that occurred since I've been at OCON, and then I'll ask you if there's a trend, and then you might offer me some suggestions about how, if that trend exists, that it would be changed in some way. We happen to have a hotel here who provides at least 4 different newspapers. So we grabbed all 4 of them and laid them down in front of 3 of us and noticed that the very same article merely used different adjectives to describe the fact, all the way from disastrous to difficult to one that was not really an adjective but a number, like 14.
What was the fact?
The fact was how the week was in Washington. Disastrous week, difficult week, to the week, and all of those adjectives tended to support how you thought the week in Washington should feel. Should this have been a disastrous week, or should this have been just a week? And so when I heard all of us, I picked one I thought was more accurate, and someone else picked someone. So it gets me to the point about, are we adjective-based news now or factual-based news? And then the second thing that happened was that one person in that group said, well, I really rely on Facebook for most of my important headlines. And the reason I thought that was so interesting was that they appear to permit their friends to be their affirmation of what is worthy news. So given those 2 observations, here's my concern. In quotation marks, fake news and its perception that it changed the outcome of the election, combined with the continued adjective-based reporting by major news organizations, is there a trend to distrust the, quote, media? And if that trend continues, will that gap be filled by, oh my gosh, government is the most reliable source of news? Facebook, social media? If that is a trend, in your opinion, then how do we change that trend? If that is a trend away from trusting the media, then who will fill that trust vacuum?
There's a lot in your question. So first, I agree with you that there is a trend toward all the news comes in the form of a tweet. And that's what a headline is. It's a tweet, or a tweet is a headline. And sometimes that's all that anybody sees. They see the titles that their friends post to social media. They don't even bother clicking on the story to read the text. And there's all kinds of mischief that can be done because of that fact. Headlines that don't actually represent the content of the story written by the reporter, completely over-exaggerated headlines, things like this. And so, yeah, one thing you can do is click on the headline, see if it matches. Don't just read the tweet or the headline. You talked about relying on your friends. And yeah, this has been a widely noted phenomenon that people put themselves now in a kind of media bubble. If all of their friends share the same political preconceptions, then you're only likely to be getting your news from people who already agree with you if you're getting it from your friends. So this is part of the reason why I think you need to go outside of social media for your news. You need to check, you need to have a set of newspaper websites you regularly visit, or some kind of systematic way of going straight to the source, going around social media. I use a lot of RSS. I use Feedly Reader to follow a number of different newspapers and blogs and journals for this purpose. If you're going to use social media to get your news, get some friends who disagree with you. I try to do this and learn interesting things. I won't comment on the question about government. Maybe you have something to say about that?
I wouldn't say something about the adjective.
Go ahead.
And see what you think about this. But I don't think just the fact that adjectives are used in headlines and things like that is problematic in news reporting and in reporting. I do think there's an incredible blending of reporting and opinion or evaluation. So there are two different acts: to identify what is going on and to evaluate what is going on. And they need to be distinguished. But I mean, a headline like, I don't know what these were exactly, but I've seen, to use disastrous, Trump's disastrous week in Washington. That, I mean, this is an evaluation of the reporter, but it's in the open, crystal clear what his evaluation is. And it is, if the story supports, like there's these 5 terrible events and so on, then it's a summation of what he's reporting, and it's an attempt at an identification. And you can think, no, that's not really what it adds up to. But that's still the attempt of its reporting and reporting of what happened in this week in Washington. But it's not that identification is value-free, and what objectivity consists in is a reporter having no viewpoint, no evaluation. He has to evaluate what he thinks is significant about what is going on. And the meaning, is it worth reporting on? What is the meaning of this event? That all has to go on. But it's still different than, this is, well, you should support Trump, or Trump's the worst president we ever had. But you can keep those distinguished, and a reporter can. Though I think, and particularly I think on cable news and so on, it's an incredible blurring of, you don't know if, do they think they're reporting, or are they just giving their opinions of what is going on? And I think it's very hard for an audience, and it's part of what, in listening to the news today, that you need to really try to distinguish what is even being said.
On the government issue, I certainly hope that the government doesn't become our substitute for our filters. The only way that we can make sure that that happens is if we ourselves, I think, start to become more responsible curators of the news and encourage more objective reporting.
Thank you.
Thanks for the talk, Ben. I enjoyed it. My question is, to what extent, if any, should we as news consumers allow the actions of individual reporters or small groups of reporters to color our perception of the organizations they work for? Example being, shortly after London Bridge attack, there was video released, taken by not a journalist, a citizen, of an entire CNN news crew, like 8 people, faking a protest. Do I no longer trust CNN at all? I mean, it's not one person, it's a whole news crew. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I know the story that you're talking about, and I should say, as a disclaimer, I saw the same video, and it's not clear to me that what's happening there is faking. There's a lot of other explanations for what we see in that video. But let's suppose you're right. And generally, it's a totally legitimate question of whether you should trust a newspaper if they have an unreliable reporter. And I mean, I think the thing to look at is, well, how does the newspaper react to this? If it's uncovered that there was some kind of malfeasance, what do they do? Do they run a correction? Do they fire the reporter? And just as an example, the New York Times, a long time ago, it was maybe 15 years ago, there was a major scandal. A guy named Jason Blair was discovered to be fabricating whole stories and just making up all the characters in the stories because they were very interesting stories, and people discovered this because he was also plagiarizing to do this. Well, the Times fired him, and not only that, they created a new position at the paper, the position of public editor, who would be responsible for writing a whole series of columns on a regular basis, commenting on how well the Times was doing at covering the stories of the day. Now, I don't claim that they always did this well, but that tells you something about how much they care about the truth. It doesn't tell you that they totally care about it. They profess to believe in all the news that's fit to print. And some of the stories that you see, you might think this is just lip service that they're paying. But even just paying lip service to the truth is important because it's something that holds them accountable, and it's something its readers can hold them accountable for. And they have to survive on the market too, and people are going to cancel their subscriptions. Now, unfortunately, the Times recently decided to discontinue its use of the public editor, probably because the one that they had on board was not very good. But I wish they hadn't just fired the editor. They should have replaced them with someone else. They're having financial problems, and they can't afford to keep having this person on board. So that gets to the point Onkar was making earlier about, there's a financial model that needs to be fixed here as well.
Is Is bias a problem in regards to being objective about the news? And is there any legitimacy to the concept of bias, given that everyone has premises that they use to draw conclusions?
You want to take this? This is a question about the concept bias and what it means and whether it is a valid concept. And there's been some debate about this, I think, among objectivists. Actually, if you go back to, well, I was the one who told you about it, actually. There was a long discussion about this on Harry Binswanger's list maybe a year and a half ago. And I think it depends on how you understand the concept. There's a certain understanding of the concept, which I think some people have a very valid worry about, which is that the idea that there are in certain ways we're hardwired to be unable to be objective, or there's something about our life experience that makes it impossible for us to be objective. And if that's what you mean by bias, then that concept has to be rejected on the grounds that objectivity is possible. We have free will. We have the ability to focus our minds or not, to use reliable methods or not, and there's nothing preventing us from doing that if we have a actually healthy, functioning brain. But you might mean other things by bias. You might simply mean someone's got a preconception that they use to inform their interpretation of the world, and it might not always be a correct preconception, but they can change it if new data comes in. So if all you mean by bias is something like preconception that you use to inform yourself about the world, we have to have those, but they don't at the same time make objectivity impossible. Our background knowledge on a topic is what enables objectivity, along with the proper choices in the use of method.
Well, one problem that comes up is how people select information that they include in a story. And that's one way that bias can create problems where you don't include essential information and you leave things out.
It is definitely a problem to leave out crucial information. It can be the result of someone's preconceptions. People should work to be more objective and correct those preconceptions when it leads them to omit important information, like in the examples that I discussed. I don't know anything else more to say about that.
I mean, I definitely agree that if bias is used as its inbuilt, inherent distortion that prevents you from being objective, it's not a legitimate concept. But do I think it's legitimate to think that, and helpful to think of in one's own thinking, am I being biased? I think you often should be asking yourself that question. Integration, so you had, I forget how you put it, something, ask yourself, does it fit? But integration is not, I've got a body of knowledge that has, and I'm certain has no errors at all anywhere in it, and then there's this new item, and it doesn't fit, so okay, I toss out this new item. Often what happens in integration is it doesn't fit, and what you find is, well, that's because I've got errors in this body that I thought was knowledge, but it's not all fully knowledge. And those errors, particularly if they're important errors, can distort your thinking. And this is why it's much easier as a young person to change your views in a fundamental way, because they're not yet solidified. You don't regard everything as knowledge. They're easier to challenge. And when a person has solidified it and he's got errors, those errors are biases that make it very hard for him to grasp now actual truths. And you should be, and this is part of what I think philosophy should teach you, that you should be really questioning, do I have errors in my thinking that I'm treating as knowledge? And don't be too quick to say, no, everything that I think is right, everything that doesn't fit should be tossed out. And that's part of what the concept bias is helping you isolate in your own thinking. And I think it's an important concept.
Thanks.
Hi there. This talk was helpful to the point of being beautiful, so thank you. My question is about, you've kind of touched on it a bit, but processes for how you're seeking out the information you now want to evaluate objectively. And one of the facets that I'd kind of noticed in like one aspect of the use of social media to kind of curate was I was in a very reactive mode. So it wasn't the act of like, I started comparing it to like memories I had of my parents, like sitting down to read a newspaper. And like the purpose of that activity was I'm going to learn something about what's going on in the world. So I was wondering, like, do you have deliberate processes? Do you guys have routines? Like, do you sit down, you set aside a time? Do you have a specific purpose? Like, are there reasons to kind of just take a general perspective? I'm going to read what happened today. And are there times when it should be, today I'm going to investigate this particular issue that's of import? But just creating routines around kind of, I want to understand the world, and then these are great processes to do it. But if you could just comment a little bit on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. And I mentioned something about it already. I use an RSS reader. And for those of you who don't know what that is, highly recommend it. It's a piece of software that you can follow through the web that allows you to subscribe to the feeds of various newspapers and other blogs. And what you see, it looks like an inbox for the web. It looks like email. And you scroll down through the headlines. And the great thing about it is that to go through it, you have to look at every headline. If you're doing it on a regular basis, you'll go one headline, then the next, then the next. That's something you definitely can't do with social media. It's even hard to do on the newspaper's own website, because, of course, when you visit the website, you only see what's new today. If you're following an RSS feed in a systematic way, you'll see everything. You don't have to read every story, but you at least see all the headlines and kind of know generally what's happening. And if you're following from a number of different sources, you know whether this headline's being reported in one source and not in another. And I definitely set aside time to scroll through my feed. I have totally fallen behind during OCON, but it's the kind of thing that I do when I've got some time to kill and when I want to meditate on the world, what's going on. Yeah.
I mean, I do. Don't have the same context exactly, because I read the news in part for my work. To know, I need to know what is going on. I need to be able to edit all kinds of things. And then I'm reading it with it's not entertainment. It's not the end of the day I turn on the news or something. I'm trying to figure out what is going on, and I read a cross section of what are considered more center. If I'm reading political kind of things, more center, I definitely read the left and some on the right. And I'm very skeptical of everything I'm reading. That, for sure, I have the mindset that most of it is incredibly slanted, often wrong. I mean, I'm at the level, because I think journalism is at a pretty deplorable state right now. I'm at the level, I will not quote anyone without going and watching the video and watching the whole thing, because there's so much just quoting out of context but that I have a different mind. I mean, it's part of my work, so that's it.
Now part of mine.
Yeah.
Hello, thanks for the talk. I have two comments to make. First of all, I think that journalism has always, for many years or decades, have been in that state. The fact that no one called it fake news doesn't mean that it wasn't happening. Otherwise, we wouldn't have so many atrocities that happened throughout so many decades. I read this book by Nassim Taleb, Fooled by Randomness. He talks about the topic of news, and he suggests that reading real-time news is sort of like a fool's task, because a lot of the stuff is written in a rush, and the incentive is not to provide objective reality, is to get a lot of clicks. So one of the things he recommends is go on social media, and on Twitter especially, this is what I do, is follow the people who you think have credibility. So I would follow someone like you, and then you are someone who's filtering news for me, and I will look at the stuff that you post. So I just wanted to know, what is your opinion about that approach?
Well, of course, everybody should follow me. But, I think you're definitely right that there's been a long history of fabrication in journalism. It is not just a recent thing. I've read a number of accounts of all the fake stories that were written during the first presidential election. George Washington was running, and there's another set of them with Adams versus Jefferson. There's a long history of this. So what's new now is just the ease of producing hoaxes on the internet. Anybody can put up a website. Anybody can spread this stuff. And so therefore we're just bombarded with so much of it.
But I would argue it's better because before the mainstream media had a monopoly, where now they were questioned. So we are in a better place right now when it comes to seeing.
I think it's true that for a long time there was mainly left-wing ideology influencing the production of media for decades. There were only 3 TV networks, and so it's good that something like Fox exists. It's good that there are any number now of alternative websites. At the same time, I think that practice makes perfect, and the newer sites haven't practiced much yet, and the newer networks don't have that much practice, and they're not as good at what they're doing. And I encourage them to get better, and it's good that they're there. So there are, and it's also true that just as the internet and modern technology make it easier to spread misinformation, it's also easier to check it. Right? And I've recommended ways to do that, though that also makes it more maddening that people don't. When some of these questions could be answered just by a simple Google search. So I think you're right that if you do find a source that you find credible, more credible than others, certainly follow it. Don't only follow that source. Follow some that you think maybe are not as credible on certain issues, but still get the facts right on others. So I mentioned Jihad Watch. I don't think that they're all that good at interpreting the events of the day, but they're very good at digging up stories about underreported terrorist attacks. And so you've got to make distinctions like that in your mind about why you're following this source, and continue to make this evaluation going forward as you continue to follow it. And if at a certain point you think, well, their quality has dropped off, or now I found somebody better,
unfollow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
He brought up fake news, and do you want to say something about fake news?
Oh, about the concept. Yeah. So I was avoiding using that concept myself, and let me actually show you why. Could you put the slides back up, please? So this is not really a point that is my own, at least not in explicit form. I owe it most explicitly to Greg Salmeri. But the way the term fake news is used today is a package deal. I think that the term originally meant something like the following. It meant outright fabrication. Like The Onion used to be fake news, right? Which people would read mostly for entertainment, and occasionally there would be a hoax that would spread, and occasionally people would confuse The Onion for the real story, which was funny. But the term has been stretched to mean now a lot of other things, because there are a lot of other degrees of non-objectivity, different kinds of problems in reporting. And I have a little list here of everything from outright fabrication all the way to true and reliable reporting. So you've got outright fabrication. There's recklessly unreliable reporting. I gave some examples of that. There's slanting, where you're getting the core facts right, but you're putting a certain spin on it. There's where you make a mistake in the facts, but it was an honest mistake, and maybe you correct it. And then there's true and reliable reporting. Well, I think fake news originally referred to the first, but it's now come to mean something else, at least in the hands of mostly the president and his associates. He now uses it to mean something like this. Everything from outright fabrication to any time the New York Times makes a mistake, that's fake news. And so it's now used as a term of disparagement to cast aspersion on any media source that anyone has any kind of problem or disagreement with. And this is a very dangerous package deal, because it destroys the concept of objectivity. Somebody who makes an honest mistake, they are much more like somebody who is a true and reliable and objective reporter than anything else on this list. And so, here's the way I would instead, so I would recommend stop using this phrase, fake news, because it's become corrupted. And instead, here's the way to draw the line: objective reporting and non-objective reporting. And A, B, and C are all non-objective in one way or another, outright fabrication or slanting. But D and E are importantly similar. There can be honest but mistaken reporting. And if the person makes the effort to correct it, they maintain their objectivity.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
I agree mostly with that, but I would not put A in the same category as slanting, for instance. So the accusation of fake news and by Trump, I think, is really, really evil. And it's to demonize the media, who are, whatever their faults, 1,000 times better than Trump. So outright falsification is no interest at all in the truth, which is what his mentality is. I mean, who is more of a purveyor in the culture now of the arbitrary? And that's why, like, I would put category A as arbitrary, and it's worse than non-objective. It's nihilism in epistemology. It's an outright attack on the truth. I mean, just think of him pre-being elected, the birther smear of Obama. He has no grounds to criticize anyone about spreading the arbitrary. He's the first practitioner and a leader of it, and is partly elected because he does that. This is, like, if you know anything about other countries and so on, this is the mentality of a dictatorship in a banana republic. This is the kind, and it's exactly the pattern of arbitrary statements all the time, and then smearing opponents as they're the purveyors of the arbitrary. It's really, really bad.
I want to say a lot, but I'm going to give it to the next person.
Hi, great talk. I wanted to ask, do you think if in free market conditions, the media, the news gravitate towards objective news reporting, or rather clickbaiting, changing the truth to make it more appealing to infotainment in general? As for somebody mentioning that government could perhaps be some option, coming from Poland with its current government and being an former Eastern Bloc country, I would not recommend that. Do you perhaps think that instead we could use some more self-regulating among the industry, or maybe maybe we should actually train our citizens to defend their reason and their brains from, this, well, not objective news reporting?
It's a good question. So I certainly think that there are aspects of the free market which can influence the quality of journalism for the better. I mean, if nobody believes you and they cancel their subscriptions, they can't keep doing that. So there's an incentive against being a fly-by-night agency of news. But at the same time, you're right. That if you have a short-term mentality, sensationalism is a way to make money. And all you have to do is read the Fountainhead and remember, Gail Winans' banner. And this is a relatively free market situation we're dealing with, right? And we have a relatively free market in news today. And I think that there are more banners out there than some people would like to believe. So it's just like the issue of education, right? I think there are ways in which private education, unregulated by the government, there are incentives that encourage equality. But it's by far, there's no guarantee. You also need to have a good philosophy of education, for instance. And in the case of journalism, you also need to have a good, philosophy of journalism, which means understanding the concept of objectivity. And so the kind of self-regulation that you need is precisely an understanding of an objective epistemology, which not enough have, but which we all have the power to teach people about.
Do you have any thoughts on media coverage of trials where a guilty verdict has not yet been reached or was not reached at all? It seems like even if a journalist is objective in his reporting of a case, the publication of a false accusation can lead to widespread misinformation and trial by media cases like Amanda Knox.
I don't have a strong view on that topic. I mean, obviously, there's a question again here of specialization, and somebody who's reporting on a trial doesn't know as much as the judge or the jury. But then again, it's the kind of thing that a journalist can sure learn a lot about if they are following the trial closely and all the testimony. It really depends upon the the nature of the publication. What are they writing for? Are they writing for a newspaper? Or are they writing for some kind of long-form magazine where they've got more space to explain themselves and make a certain case? That's kind of less journalism and more, essay writing then.
Can you repeat the question? Because you answered something that I didn't take as quite the question. So.
Do you have thoughts on media coverage of trials prior to or absent of a guilty verdict? Meaning that if somebody just arbitrarily falsely accuses someone of something, then their face is in the newspaper with this person's being accused of whatever, and the person never. I think actually I've heard that in Britain they actually made that kind of reporting illegal. There has to be a guilty verdict reached because it's like almost like libel to have such a thing out there.
But you're talking about an actual trial going on and a reporter reporting.
Right.
But that's a judicial proceeding. It's not that you're not slandering. If he's been, if you have an objective court system, so if you're living in a free country, it's not a Soviet Union or something reporting on a trial, then it's important that the government's proceedings and its use of force be scrutinizable by the public, and this is one of the crucial roles of a journalist and of a newspaper, to cover that. Now, you can cover it in a non-objective way, but there's nothing inherent in covering a trial that you have to cover it non-objectively, so they should be reporting what actually goes on. We've had many cases, but take the O.J. Simpson trial. It was important that trial was reported and what is going on, but it showcased some of the sad state of the current legal system, but it's important for citizens to know that and to be able to take action and vote for politicians who are talking about, well, I want to reform the system. Well, why do you want to reform it? Well, cases like this. And so it has to be open. It should be reported. But yes, you could slander, but you can slander people in all kinds of ways, not just because they're under investigation or something like that.
And journalists usually try to solve this problem by saying allegedly, right, after everything that they report.
Thank you.
I think that's all the time we have. So thanks, everyone.